David is Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University. His book, Atlantic Africa and the Spanish Caribbean, was awarded the Lepidus Center's Harriet Tubman Prize and the American Historical Association's James A. Rawley Prize. He recently co-edited two essay collections, The Spanish Caribbean and the Atlantic World in the Long 16th Century with Ida Altman, which came out 2019, and From the Galleons to the Highlands, Slave Trade Routes in the Spanish Americas, together with Alex Brudsky and Davis Atis, and this book was published last year in 2020. His recent publications examine the itineraries of a Caribbean woman of African descent who owned her own ship in the 1590s, intermediaries who facilitated the slave trade from Sierra Leone in the mid-16th century, and the polyfunctional nature of early modern Iberian slave ships. Today, David is going to talk on the early slave trade from Angola to Brazil in the Spanish Caribbean. David, it's really a pleasure to have you here, and we are all now looking forward to hearing more about this subject from you. Thank you very much again for coming and joining us here.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak. It's much appreciated. And for all the courtesies, I really appreciate that. And I would have preferred, of course, to be there in person. I think I would have very much enjoyed it. But you know, we're making do here, right? With what we can. Let's see. So let me just before I start, let me just a couple of acknowledgements I'd like to make. Some of the research that I'll be presenting has been done in collaboration with Mark Eagle of Western Kentucky University. And much of this work has been inspired by some of the works in progress of Kara Schultz. And one important document that I will talk about a bit today, I found it thanks to a tip from Alex Baruki. So I am, in a sense, speaking on behalf of, and hopefully in dialogue with, and certainly in debt to some other scholars who are doing very, very cool work. Jennifer Wolf, actually, who is here too. People doing very cool work in this during this period, and more or less during this period, and on similar themes. So I'll just share my screen here and launch into the presentation. But once again, thank you so much to Stephen and to Janine and to everyone for the kind invitation. All right, so I will share my screen. So a presentation, the early slave trade from Angola to Brazil and the Spanish Caribbean. I want to begin by talking with a government official, the first governor of, as he's often known today, the first governor of Portuguese Angola, or the territory that would later be known as Angola. Now, Paulo Dias de Novais. He had previously formed part of a Portuguese embassy to Angola in the 1560s, and was held captive there for several years. He received a carta donataria, a license, essentially awarded by the Portuguese crown in 1571, to go back to Angola as the governor, captain, and conquistador. So there was this very clear, apparently a very clear intention for him to take power over this territory in West Central Africa. Well before he actually went in 1575. So much of my information, biographical information about Paulo Dias de Novais, I'm taking from the geographer and prolific writer, as I have here, Elidio de Amaral, who passed away not long ago. And as Amaral tells us repeatedly in this one of his works, many aspects of the journey that Paulo Dias de Novais, future governor of Angola, took from Lisbon to Angola in 1574, 1575, many aspects of his journey remain unknown or subject to sometimes heated debate. The exact date of his arrival in Luanda Island, the number of ships in his fleet, his own socioeconomic origins, his funding, the manner in which he was able to finance this expedition. We know that he was the grandson of the even more famous navigator Bartolomeu Diaz. We know a few aspects of his biography. He departed from Lisbon in late 1574 with a fleet of ships. Depending on the source one uses, in a fleet of 5 ships or 7 ships or 9 ships. They stopped in Madeira. They stopped in the Cape Verde Islands. Finally arrived in Luanda Island on February 11th or February 20th in 1575. Where they immediately encounter 7 ships from São Tomé, from the islands of São Tomé in the Gulf of Guinea, that were already there trading for enslaved Africans. So according to Amaral, the geographer historian Amaral, the village of Sao Paulo de Luanda on the mainland began to be occupied by Novais, the new governor, and the group of people who came with him early in 1576. So the following few years were, again, according to Amaral, were a time of friendly contact, peaceful diplomacy with this states large and small in that area, particularly in Ndongo. And so with the exception of a short period in which the Portuguese waged war against Kasanji or Kasanzi, right? Again, depending on the source one uses and the interpretation of that source. These are different peoples in different places. So to partially quote Amaral directly, for reasons that remain poorly explained, this peaceful situation, which lasted roughly 5 years, changed completely in 1579, 1580, witnessing the beginnings of a series of wars of conquest throughout the Kwanza Valley in the direction of the much sought after but imaginary silver mines that many believe to exist in Kambambe. So farther in, as Amaral and Beatrix Heinz have observed, Novais's Carta Donataria, right, written almost a decade earlier at that point, the license that he was, I'm using the term license, I don't know if that's quite accurate, this grant and instructions that he was given by the Portuguese crown in 1571, possibly even 1570, instructed him to subject and conquer, right? So there was a period of preparation, and there was a period of, until say 1575, and there was a period of peaceful relations, and then war, long-term, almost continuous warfare breaks out between the Portuguese and the state of Ndongo, and other soldados, political units in the area, starting in 1579, 1580. So that's just sort of background information that I wanted to present about Paulo Dias de Novais, the chronological and political from the European viewpoint background and context. The transatlantic slave trade from Angola in the early 17th century, which has been better studied and really in many ways dominates our knowledge of the slave trade, of the transatlantic slave trade during the 17th century, is slave trafficking the trafficking of enslaved people from Angola, from the area that would become known as Angola. So this traffic was strongly associated with this series of wars in which quote unquote Portuguese soldiers, many of whom were not, most of whom were not professional soldiers, but degredados, people who were exiled essentially or banished to Angola. As other historians have noted, the term criminal exile and soldier was used almost interchangeably in this period. So the slave traffic from Angola during the first half of the 17th century was associated with these wars in which Portuguese soldiers, aided by Imbangala mercenaries, there's a big literature on this also, enslaved tens of thousands of people who lived in these states, particularly to the south and southeast of Congo. This period of Angola's history is documented in great detail in the scholarship of Beatrix Heinz, wonderful, wonderful work. I have often considered, I haven't done it yet, I've also considered trying to learn to read German so that I can follow Beatrix Heinz's work on Angola in particular more closely. So it's still a long-term goal, shall we say. But also in the scholarship of Linda Haywood and John Thornton and other scholars, including, of course, the late Joe Miller. who I wish he were here. The Atlantic slave trade from West Central Africa prior to the very late 16th century. So before this period, before the early 17th, very late 16th century, the slave trade remains obscure. I mean, we know very little about it, and appears to have been shaped by other factors that are become less important than this Portuguese and Bangala warfare against Ndongo in the early 17th century. So for the 16th century, we have to consider the political and commercial interests of the rulers of the Kingdom of Congo and their efforts to influence or prevent Portuguese relations with Ndongo. We also have to consider the vizinhos, the residents of São Tomé, people who resided in the islands of São Tomé and Príncipe, their involvement in the slave trade, going back much earlier to the 1550s, probably early, and definitely earlier for Congo, probably before the 1550s, even for what would later be considered Angola, south of the Kingdom of Congo. We also have to consider, of course, the evolving relations between the more powerful African rulers in West Central Africa, particularly the Angola, right, the highest political authority of Ndongo, and Sobas, which is a term that referred to the leaders of these usually smaller independent territories. And there are hundreds of small independent territories known as sobados, later in Portuguese, because they were ruled by a soba. So the relationships, the evolving dynamic relationships between these different political units, this has been the subject, right, of a great deal of scholarship, particularly by Beatrice Heinz, Joe Miller, and others. And you know, it's challenging to get back into the 16th century, right? We know much more about the 17th century because it's much better documented. Political events align more closely with, you know, a more sustained, more pronounced presence of Portuguese administrators, European missionaries, etc. Right. So what I'm trying to get at is this: the very beginnings of the slave trade after, you know, after Paulo Dias de Novais arrives in Angola, before this warfare breaks out, and before it begins to be really well documented in Spanish American sources in the early 17th century, late 16th, early 17th. So what's happening in the 1570s, 1580s? And I'll come back to this question repeatedly. So here are a couple of quotes from primary sources that are fairly well known. The first one is by a missionary and written in Angola in November 1576. And he writes, "There's so many slaves," right? I'm roughly translating and quoting here. "There's so many slaves that leave from here each year, bought and sold. There's normally around 12,000 pesas or pieces or units or heads would be a good translation. There's normally 12,000 pesas are bought and sold here each year." And he says this year, 1576, the previous year, 1575 rather, 4,000 who died, 4,000 captives who died, but there were still 14,000, pesas, which I'm going to use interchangeably with captives, although there's, reason to, there's reason to question whether this, this association of one pesa with is the same necessarily as one enslaved person. Right? There's good grounds to think that this may have been a unit, even this early. This may have been a unit for evaluating enslaved people instead of necessarily corresponding to one person. But he's saying that the previous year, 14,000 people had been exported, bought and sold, and that another 4,000 had died, during that process. And so he wonders in this quote, how were all these people enslaved? And he says, "I believe that almost all of them were slaves of the king, and because they rose up, rising up at every step." I'm sorry, translating for the, earlier when I should have translated this already, rising up at every step. And so because they rose up against the king, they incur the death penalty according to their laws. And I believe he's referring to political authorities in Angola and not to the king of Portugal at this point. So this missionary states that by the own laws of the country, and he's using sort of a European idea of, of sovereignty, right? In this case, but basically they rose up against the king. They were, and they were enslaved, thousands and thousands of people. So for a very different quote, this is currently in the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid, Spain. And this is also, published in this nice little, sort of tattered now volume, Angola, in the times of Philip II and III. So this is Jerónimo de Castaño, another eyewitness who was there at the time, in the 1570s. He later relates that Paulo Dias de Novais left Lisbon, arrived at the Kingdom of Angola, where he made war against the blacks. And again, I'm quoting here, in such manner that he conquered and subjected 60 leagues of the mainland. Now, and this wouldn't happen for quite a long time, actually. So this is rather exaggerated, right? Highly exaggerated. So he conquered and subjected 60 leagues of the mainland and a great number of let's say people who remained subjected and obedient. Again, this is in the realm of imagination a little bit. Who remained subjected and obedient to the royal crown, paying tribute every month to His Majesty, and things were thus until 1578. And from the Kingdom of Angola in this time, more than 50,000 slaves were purchased, which flooded, and the actual word they use is to filled, which filled up the state of Brazil, the land of Brazil. So 50,000 enslaved Africans taken from Angola, even before 1578, right? According to this source, right? So there's clearly John Thornton actually is one of the people who's written about this. There are tens of thousands of people being exported as enslaved, right? Enslaved Africans coming out of Angola even before the formal large-scale warfare between Portugal, aided by the Imbangala, against the Kingdom of Dongo, right, and others. Right, so this is a very substantial slave trade for this period, if these numbers are anywhere close to accurate, right? So let me go on. So one of the reasons I became interested in learning more about this was because several years ago, when I was doing research in collaboration with Mark Eagle on the 16th century transatlantic slave trade, and just trying to find out what we know. How do we know what we know, right? If we know anything. The transatlantic slave trade database, also known as voyages or slavevoyages.org, this data set at that time, and can say approximately 2015, at that time contained information for, at that time, about 150 voyages, now down to 144, that were transported or registered to transport enslaved Africans from any part of Africa to anywhere in the Americas during the years 1579 to 1585. So during that period of, say, 6 years, a total of 140, 150 known or speculatively known slaving voyages, or voyages that were believed to have probably existed. For most of these, for roughly 2/3 of these voyages, I think it used to be, I think it's still 97, yes, 97 voyages. I have circled 97 here. For 97 of these voyages, of all the slaving voyages known to have existed, transatlantic slaving voyages known to have existed in that 6-year period, there was one and only one source cited. And I was not familiar with this source, and neither was Mark. So I was very interested in this very important source for the 16th century Atlantic slave trade. Curiously, this source, according to the interpretation at that time of this source, indicated that for all 97 voyages, voyages believed to have existed, that they all probably, right, and this is an imputed, right, a guess, right, they all probably took enslaved Africans to Spanish America. So after looking in shipping records for over a dozen different Spanish American ports, And this is a huge amount of research, and it's ongoing. And other people, for example, Jennifer or Wolf are doing more. At Kara Schultz, for Puerto Rico, Kara Schultz for Buenos Aires, Joe Clark for Veracruz, among other people, right, that have done much more detailed and are currently doing more detailed work using these shipping records for specific places. But after Mark and I did this, significantly large survey of shipping records for different Spanish American ports during this period. And we were only to confirm the arrival of one of these voyages. So these are a large number of voyages for which no other information exists. So we were very curious to know more about this source. So we went to the Biblioteca da Ajuda in Lisbon. We found the source. I transcribed it in detail, in word for word. And it's a wonderful, wonderful source that lists planned slaving voyages beginning in 1579, with taxes paid by voyage backers for upcoming slaving voyages, and the name of the ship and the name of the shipmaster, the person who would be in charge of loading captives onto that ship and disembarking them in their destination. So it's essentially a list of taxes paid for planned slaving voyages between 1579 and 1585, before these ships ever set sail, if they did. Right? But a really wonderful list because it provides a fantastic amount of information. What we didn't ever find, I found out later, it took me quite a while to acquire this. I found out later that Antonio de Almeida Mendez, in his dissertation from 2007, was already aware of this source and had transcribed and in detail. And here he has this, he didn't have a transcription, but he has this wonderful chart, which is absolutely 100% accurate towards the back as an appendix of his dissertation. I was finally able to access this dissertation on microfiche. Unfortunately, I had to access it. So imagine me here in Michigan accessing a 700-page dissertation published in French, only available on microfiche, which I then have to painstakingly. It was an experience. It was a learning experience, a growing experience, as we say. I believe this is where the Voyages database originally, I don't know for a fact, but I believe this is where they got this information based on Antonio Mendez's research in Biblioteca da Ajuda. And I'm not aware that anyone has ever analyzed this source in much detail otherwise. So one of the things that I've done is to go through and match the amount of money paid by voyage backers with possible destinations or zones of embarkation in West Central Africa or in Angola. In Angola or São Tomé. So by my reasoning, right, since voyage backers pay taxes of 2,000 reais for each pesa, possibly corresponding to one captive, probably not. But voyage backers paid taxes of 2,000 reais for each pesa to be transported from São Tomé and 3,000 reais for each pesa from Angola. So for this whole list of a little over 90 voyages, we can divide the amount that was paid by the stated number of pesas that each ship was supposed to embark in order to determine whether that ship intended to embark captives in São Tomé or in Angola. Right, so this is playing with numbers that I'm not particularly good at, but I think I felt in this case it was certainly worth trying to get an idea of where these vessels were going to go, supposedly. And so according to these registered voyages, which were really, according to the taxes paid for these planned voyages, this list shows 59 vessels that were going to Angola, where they would pick up almost 7,700 pesas, and a little over 30 vessels headed for São Tomé. They would pick up a little over 3,000 pesas, with the amounts of reais, the amounts of money paid and taxes for each of these. I think it's important to and I stress this repeatedly, we don't really know what happened for the vast majority of these voyages. They were planned voyages. Some voyage backers of vencedores or some ship masters might have stated their intention to embark captives in São Tomé, but then may have gone to Angola instead, or vice versa. Some of the vessels may have never sailed. Some of the vessels may have been replaced later by a different ship with a completely different destination, a different shipmaster, right? So we see this all the time, and both actually, we see all of these things happening all the time in Spanish sources during this period, and even long before this period. So it's very important to, I think, to recognize that these voyages didn't necessarily ever take place, or they didn't take place in the way they were planned. There are a few inconsistencies in this list. For example, one voyage backer paid the Angola rate for a vessel that was supposedly going to embark captives in São Tomé. This might be an error in the source. I have arbitrarily assumed that the vessel went to São Tomé, but another person might say, well, it probably went to Angola, because if they paid this rate, right, surely it was just an error on the part of the scribe. I'm willing to change that from São Tomé to Angola, right? No problem. But for about 90 voyages, this method, this sort of simple calculation, provides a good way of speculating whether these vessels intended to embark enslaved Africans in São Tomé or in Angola. There's 6 other voyages that don't fall into one of these categories, because the rate that they paid doesn't correspond to either Angola or São Tomé. So maybe they, maybe something else is going on. Maybe they intended to embark captives in both places. I don't know. For 3 voyages, and this is also very important, 3 voyages paid a completely different rate of 4,000 reais, because they intended to embark captives, it's not clear where, and then transport them to Spanish America or to Indias. So for 3 voyages, and I have an example of one here. So Luis Perez and his comrades, and others, on September 16th of the aforementioned year. I don't remember which year this was. Paid 800,000 reais for 200 pesos. So a rate of 4 reais, actually 4,000 reais, for 4 reais for being from São Tomé, to take them to the Indies and the ship São João, shipmaster Manuel Diaz. So in this case, it's very clearly stated, this is the only voyage that it's very clearly stated, these captives are going to be embarked in São Tomé and taken to Spanish America. There's 2 or 3 other voyages where that is similar information, a similar rate was paid. So we can speculate that they were planning to go to Spanish America. Notice that this rate was much higher. If the ship planned to go to Spanish America, they had to pay a much higher rate. Right? And this is pretty well known already. So very recently, from what I'm told, and then from what I was able to confirm for myself yesterday, so I spoke with the people who operate the Voyages database, with David Eltis, Alex Baruchi, and others who actually maintain this database. I told them my thinking about this source, and they've updated many, not all yet, but many of these voyages. They've updated them to show this new information. So instead of going to Spanish America, most of these voyages are now going to the Iberian world, port unspecified, because we've not been able to confirm that these are going to Spanish America, and there's only this indication exists for 3, perhaps 4 of these voyages. Any of them could have gone to Spanish America eventually, but my argument is that these vessels were going to Brazil, probably Brazil, possibly to Portugal, possibly to the Iberian Peninsula. But I think this is essentially a new or underutilized source for the slave trade to Brazil during this time period that hasn't been sufficiently analyzed. People don't know about it, and I haven't really used this source yet. So, for example, a recent article by Daniel Domingues da Silva and Alexandre Vieira Ribeiro, there's a wonderful survey in 1 or 2 pages of known sources for the slave trade to 16th century Brazil north of Rio, they didn't mention this source. So I think it's a new development essentially. So I would like to add another, mindful of my time here, I would like to add to that another previously unknown source that's held in the Archive of the Indies in Seville. And this is the document that Alex Baruchi mentioned to me, and I was able to follow up on his tip and found this wonderful source. This document, which is fairly lengthy, it shows that the 1574-1575 expedition of Paulo Dias de Novais, when he's returning to Angola to become the first governor of Portuguese Angola, that this expedition was at least partly financed by a Lisbon merchant named Hector Dias, who was from Lisbon, but he was living in Seville as a vecino of Seville at that time. So in April 1586, this is 10 years after, you can see the nice little date here at the top. This is 10 years after, 10 or 11 years after Novais's voyage to take on the role of governor in the new Portuguese settlement of colony of Angola. So 10 years later, after the fact, Diaz brings this lawsuit before the House of Trade, La Casa de la Contratación, in Seville, regarding an agreement that he had made in Lisbon in 1574 with Pablo Dias de Novais, as he appears in this source. And it's kind of probably too small to read, but you can see down here, Pablo Dias de Novais. And so, according to Hector Dias, this Lisbon merchant who later would move to Seville, he had agreed to loan 2 galleons to Novais, both of which were named Santo Antonio, for this upcoming voyage to Luanda. These galleons were 2 of the ships in the fleet that would take Novais back to Angola, this time as governor and quote unquote conquistador in late 1574, early 1575. So this source, mentions several other ships, I think 7, and 2 of them were these galleons that were loaned to Novais by this Lisbon merchant Hector Dias. So you're now going to encounter my rudimentary map skills here for the next few slides, for which I apologize profusely. So the galleons, and I have little dotted lines here to indicate, planned itineraries. So these galleons in the larger fleet, right, would sail directly from Lisbon to Angola. Once in Angola, they were to embark. These 2 galleons only, were, as far as we know, these 2 galleons owned by Hector Dias, loaned to Novais, these 2 galleons were to embark enslaved Africans and then bring those captives directly back to Lisbon, stopping only if necessary in Madeira or in the Cape Verde Islands. So the galleons were to be administered by Baltasar Alvarez, who was this merchant, this Lisbon merchant, Hector Diaz's brother, and by a man who I don't know anything about, identified as Gonçalo Dias. Novais's guarantor, his fiador, the person who provided insurance, essentially saying that, well, if anything goes wrong or you can't pay, I will compensate Hector Dias. Novais's guarantor was his own father, Antonio Dias de Novais, or Novares, as he appears in this document, which is in both Portuguese and Spanish translation, which in the latter being much easier for me to read. So we know we learn a little bit from this source about part of the financing of the Novais expedition, that we didn't know previously. And there's additional information that I'm going to skip over for now. But according to Hector Dias, to give you just the general idea of this case that he brings before the House of Trade in Seville, according to Hector Dias, the galleons departed as planned from Lisbon with Novais and his family, eventually reaching Luanda Island. And so now I have solid lines to indicate actual voyage itinerary here, right, in the little map on the right. Right, and here is an illustration from 1630 of Luanda Island, the city of Sao Paulo. So these galleons eventually reached Luanda Island. As noted by Lídio do Amaral, the vessel stopped in both Madeira and the Cape Verde Islands along the way. After disembarking the illustrious passengers, Novais's family and other passengers, their possessions and supplies, the 2 galleons apparently right away began to embark African captives. And this is all still going according to the agreement made by Hector Dias with Novais. At this time, Hector Dias's brother, Baltasar Alvarez, and Paulo Dias de Novais himself made a new agreement with an individual named Francisco Rebolo. So this is a new person who suddenly enters the picture in Luanda, possibly even on Luanda Island at this point. They make a new agreement with an individual named Francisco Rebolo, who claimed to have authorization to take the enslaved Africans to the Indies of Castile, to Spanish America. So this is right after Novais himself returns to Luanda Island as the brand new first governor of Portuguese Angola, right? The same galleons that brought two of the same galleons that brought him and his family are now going, they have this mission to bring enslaved Africans back to Lisbon, but Francisco Rebolo presents this opportunity in Luanda. Well, wait, we can take them to Spanish America instead. And so, according to the galleon's disgruntled owner, Hector Diaz, one of these ships, only one, not both, one of these galleons was loaded with 500 enslaved Africans, loaned to Francisco Rebolo, this new person on the scene, and the plan was to set sail for Spanish America, going to New Spain, going to Veracruz or San Juan de Ulua off the Gulf Coast of Mexico. So again, a planned itinerary that doesn't go according to plan. But so this was completely against the agreement that had previously been made with the galleon's owner, Hector Diaz. I don't know what happened to the other galleon. I have heard, a rumor that I haven't confirmed yet, but I believe the source, Manolo Fernandez Chavez, tells me that Francisco Rebolo was a vecino of Triana in Seville. Rebolo was a person who resided primarily in Seville, Spain. But here he was in Luanda at the time that Paulo Dias de Novais was arriving to set up his new governorship. So this galleon that Rebolo was going to take to New Spain, to Mexico, this galleon under Rebolo's command would sail in the company of a caravel, which, confusingly enough, was also named San Anton. Remember the galleon Santo Antonio, the caravel San Anton, under the command of another new person, Pedro Colombo, who was a vecino of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria. So I believe that this galleon and other crew members, as it turned out later, were also from Tenerife or Gran Canaria. So I believe the caravel sailed from the Canary Islands, roughly paralleling the route of the Novais expedition down to Luanda. And so this was probably the caravel that brought Francisco Rebolo to Luanda too. So this caravel that Francisco Rebolo had arrived in, under the command of shipmaster Pedro Colombo, would sail alongside the galleon with 500 enslaved Africans. The caravel would carry an additional 250 enslaved Africans. So with these two vessels, about 750, and this is the plan, right? We don't know what actually happened for the most part, but the plan was to carry these 750 enslaved Africans to New Spain, in the case of the galleon, and to Honduras in the case of the caravel. All right. So let's see. Soon after their departure, from Luanda, the captives on board the smaller caravel rose up. So this is a caravel that allegedly carried, according to Hector Diaz 10 years later, allegedly carried 250 enslaved people aboard. The captives rose up, killing shipmaster Pedro Colombo. As you can see, I have a rather dramatic X there on top of these, planned itinerary, these arrows. So the captives rose up, killing the shipmaster Pedro Colombo and all of the other crew members on board the caravel. So they completely seized control of the caravel, the enslaved West Central Africans, right? But the galleon was not far behind, promptly overtook the caravel, and retook the caravel, actually. Many of the Africans who had resisted and presumably continued to resist were killed. Others threw themselves into the sea. And I have a, one of quotes pertaining to this up here, habiendo muerto mucha parte de esclavos por haberse levantado. So a large portion of the slaves had died because they rose up, right, on account of having risen up, right? Is what one Spanish or Portuguese witness much later in the Caribbean that's how they'll describe this. That's how they'll describe this, and then this short version will then be blurbed by officials of the House of Trade in Seville. So we know there was a massive slave revolt that completely ended up in successfully seizing control of one of these two vessels. But the larger vessel, fought back and essentially ensured that the captives would be enslaved, those who survived. So the two vessels, presumably approximately 500 enslaved Africans who were on the galleon, were then distributed between these two ships, between the caravel, after many of the captives aboard had been killed. So in December 1575 and early 1576, so this is right about the time when Paulo Dias de Novais and his contemporaries are moving from Luanda Island to the mainland, to what would become the village and later city of Sao Paulo de Luanda. This is right at the same time that Luanda is just beginning to be established. December 1575 and early 1576, the galleon arrives in Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. The caravel lands nearby in Ocoa. So these were like many other voyages that were allegedly going to Mexico, or transatlantic voyages that were allegedly going to New Spain, particularly to Veracruz, or in this case, one that was allegedly going to Honduras. We can only confirm that they arrived in this island. This is as far as they went. I know the captives that were on the caravel were sold locally, as I'll show you in a second. On the galleon. As for the caravel, I'm not sure if some of the captives continued on to Honduras, or as planned. And of course, we have no idea usually what happens to these captives after they're sold in Santo Domingo or in the island of Hispaniola. They could then be redistributed elsewhere, including to New Spain. But as far as the actual itineraries of the voyages, as far as the Caribbean, this is my representation of what we know. So here on the island of Hispaniola, some aspects of these voyages appear to have been deliberately concealed by Rebollo and the surviving crew after their arrival in Hispaniola. Rebollo and his crew even appear to have withheld their actual port of departure, right, Luanda, or Luanda Island probably, not only from Santo Domingo officials, but even from the vecinos in Santo Domingo, Hispaniola, who testified on their behalf. So there was because these were unplanned, unscheduled arrival in the island of Hispaniola, there was this investigation that took place, and a lengthy one, which is actually Escribania 1A, and part of Escribania 1A. So it's a long case, but apparently during this course of this investigation in Hispaniola, Rebollo and crew members lied and concealed various aspects of their voyage. At least one witness who testified on behalf of Rebollo assumed that the ship had sailed from São Tomé. So in an earlier publication, I followed this evidence and said, well, clearly the ship sailed from São Tomé. I knew that all of the captives were from Angola, or described as being from the land of Angola, but I assumed that the ship had passed through São Tomé. But now we know otherwise. The case that Hector Diaz 10 years later brought to the attention of officials in Seville, House of Trade officials in Seville, resulted in the reevaluation of some of these testimonies. And so the case from 1586 has all these marginal notes saying, well, these are obviously fake names. The sailors gave fake names just to match the registration papers. It also is clear that the registration papers that Rebollo used in Hispaniola had already been used twice previously in 1572, 4 years earlier. I'm not sure in Hispaniola or in Puerto Rico, but he never had authorization to undertake this voyage, despite his claims to have authorization when he's in Luanda, and despite this registration they presented upon arriving in Hispaniola. Some of the other details that appear both in the Hispaniola investigation and in the much later case that Hector Diaz brought to the House of Trade in Seville, some of these details in both can be confirmed by other sources. I'll just give you a quick example. Here's another reference to enslaved Africans rising up and killing Pedro Colombo, the shipmaster of the caravel, and the pilot of the caravel, and all the other mariners, sailors aboard that vessel. And here is, for example, a published notarial record from Las Palmas de Gran Canaria in the Canary Islands from October 1576. So just less than a year, a little more than a year after the arrival of these vessels in the Caribbean, the widow, Pedro Colombo's widow in Las Palmas de Gran Canaria, writes, right, and this is the summary provided by Manuel Lobo Cabrera, who wrote abstracts of these hundreds of notarial records in this wonderful source. Ursula Munoz, the widow of Pedro Colombo, who was, and I'm quoting his abstract, who was killed by the blacks in Guinea, authorizes another person to collect any debts or anything that they might be owed on behalf of herself and her children. Right, and there are other notarial records that have similar, with similar, widows asking, for the goods of their deceased sailor husband, to be sent to them in Portugal, or for or elsewhere in the Canary Islands. A sailor who participated in one of these voyages later mentions it in a subsequent notarial record. So we can confirm that this happened. The best evidence for this happening, for these voyages happening, is this sales of at least 245 enslaved Africans in Santo Domingo, Hispaniola, following the arrival of the galleon. So I have the red dots here indicate Ocoa, where the caravel arrived, and slightly earlier in Santo Domingo, where the galleon under Francisco Rebolo arrived, and where this source was generated. And so this is, I just have underlined in red here in the document, the opening phrase for each enslaved person who was sold, rematóse otra negra de tierra Angola. So another black woman, or another black man, or another black boy, or another black girl from the Angola land was sold. And then they provide details: who purchased this person, who the price that they paid, and the date. And so nearly all of these, almost 250 enslaved people, are being described as of the Angola land, de tierra Angola. Almost half of them are identified as negras or negritas, as black women or black girls, right? This is a theme that we'll see later on in voyages arriving from Angola to different ports in the Spanish Americas in the 17th century. But in this case, we know that a large number of male captives had probably been killed shortly beforehand, during and immediately after this massive revolt aboard the caravel. All right, so I'm shifting to more rudimentary graphs here. So here is a graph, and what I want to do is steer my talk towards thinking about some of the reasons I think this 1575 voyage is important, and what it can tell us about the broader transatlantic slave trade during this period, during the really the final 3 decades of the 16th century, really between the 1570s and 1580s, early 1590s. This is a really pivotal period, not only in Portuguese efforts to establish the colony of Angola, right, at the expense of people who already lived there, right. I'm thinking of Alan Castro's book Trato dos Viventes, right. This Brazil was constructed at the expense of Angola, right. This sort of really poetic argument that makes a lot of sense. But this is also important for the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade to Spanish America, which from Angola, which really starts to take off at the same time. So I want to talk a small amount about this. So here I have a representation of 1,082 slaving voyages that we can confirm arrived in Spanish America between 1519 and 1650. And this organized by 5-year periods, by quinquennium. Lustro sounds better, I think, by 5-year period. And the area of embarkation, where captives were embarked. So we know, and this is based on research that Mark Eagle and I have done together over the past few years. We know of roughly 2,000 voyages to Spanish America, either intended voyages or arrivals, right? Approximately 2,000 arriving in Spanish America during this period of, say, 130 years. For 1,082 of them, we can confirm that they arrived, that we can confirm that the slaving voyage arrived in Spanish America, and we have some indication of where that vessel embarked captives, right? So this is our good data, basically, for this, in terms of thinking about provenance. The data is much better for the 17th century, but this is what we can say at this point, right? So you can see the trajectory, chronological trajectory of the arrivals of enslaved people exported from the Cape Verde Islands, or from the Upper Guinea coast, or Rio de Guinea, from São Tomé, from Arlen Calabar, and from Angola. And what stands out, of course, is the slave trade from Angola, which has been known as, following Linda Haywood and John Thorne, as the Angola wave, right, which primarily to Spanish America. So just focusing on these 568 voyages that we currently know about from Angola to Spanish America, this is what the curve looks like if you divide it in 5-year periods. And so there's this really, really steep increase in the slave trade from Angola beginning in the late 1590s, early 1590s. Enriqueta Vilar and others have studied the slave trade during the era of the Portuguese asientos, beginning 1595 to 1640. What we can see here is that this starts to happen much earlier, right? It's considerably earlier, and there's already a substantial slave trade to Brazil, right? In the late 1570s, early 1580s, going by the source I talked about earlier, the Biblioteca da Ajuda source. And here we have this 1575, 1576, right? These two voyages, actually, the galleon and the caravel, arriving on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, a good 10 years before the slave trade to Spanish America from Angola starts to gradually increase. I'd say 15, 20 years before this massive surge of voyages from Angola to Spanish America, the Angola wave. So in trying to think about the chronological importance of this voyage, was it a predecessor? Were these the voyages that set a precedent, right? That set this precedent for shifting the slave trade from Angola toward Brazil, from shifting it from Brazil toward the Spanish Americas, or was it a precedent that alerted investors, voyage backers, to the very real possibility of future voyages from Angola to Spanish America, right? So I'm in trying to answer this question, I said, well, the slave trade from São Tomé to Spanish America had been going on for quite some time by this point. It's pretty clear that people in Spanish America would have already known about the availability to some extent of enslaved people from West Central Africa. So if we include São Tomé, the voyage is not the 1575 voyages are not they're not this clear precedent necessarily. I mean, you have to consider São Tomé also. And if you want to go farther back, right, we know of the first slaving voyage from São Tomé to the Americas to Puerto Rico, actually arrived around 1522, right? The wonderful book Puerto Rico Negro by Jalisco Badillo and Ángel López Cantos, right, mentions this voyage. So slave traffic, the traffic of enslaved people from São Tomé to the Caribbean had already been established for 50 years, right, by the time Francisco Rebolo and Pedro Colombo departed from Luanda. In the early 1550s, if not sooner, enslaved Africans were already being brought from Angola to São Tomé. So that's the earliest evidence I'm aware of, but Bracio Monumento Maquinaria Africana and Arlindo Manuel Caldeira and other people have written about this. So the 1550s is and much earlier slave trade, even by the certainly before the 1530s, from from Congo to São Tomé. So really in 1570s, this is pretty far into the story of slave trafficking from West Central Africa to the Iberian world. What's new is that there are direct voyages from Angola to Spanish America. This is what's new, not so much the presence of West Central Africans being brought as enslaved people to Spanish or Portuguese territories. All right. So I apologize for the rudimentariness of my charts here, but so if we plot on top of this, if I can go back, so on top of this graph, we can also plot the intended voyages that would go, that were supposed to go to pick up enslaved Africans in Angola and São Tomé, and then presumably take them to Brazil or possibly Lisbon. We know for one of the very small number of these voyages that did show up in 1585, actually in Spanish America. One of these voyages stated, well, we were sailing from Angola on the way to Brazil when we were blown off course, right? So I suspect that most of these 80, 90 voyages, if they sailed, would have gone toward Brazil, or possibly some number of them may have gone back to Lisbon, like the galleons that Hector Diaz loaned to Paulo Dias de Novais. Probably one of those two galleons did return to Lisbon with enslaved Africans aboard, right? So we can't directly compare these two types of data, known voyages located in Spanish American shipping records and planned voyages that were recorded in Lisbon when taxes were being paid before the voyages set. So we can't really compare them, but we can speculate about the the possible relationship. And this is very, very speculative, but we can speculate about possible relationship between these 59 planned voyages that were going to embark captives in Angola in the late 1570s to the mid 1580s. And you can see if there were 59 ships, the way it would appear on this chart, because it's sort of these 59 vessels would be spread across 2 5-year periods. It would, it's sort of stretched across here. But if you just plotted 59 ships as one dot, it would be up closer to here, right? So we can speculate, as I say, about the relationship between these planned voyages potentially to Brazil and the later and larger, perhaps, slave trade from Angola to Spanish America. We don't know for the 1590s and very early 1600s. We don't know what the slave trade from Angola to Brazil looked like, because we don't have very many records of arrivals in Brazil for this period. Very few, very, very, very few. So, was the Angola wave not only to Spanish America, but also was it also exponentially larger because it was also shipping enslaved Africans to Brazil? Probably yes. Qualitative data indicates that yes. So anyway, there's a great deal of work to be done in trying to match the political circumstances in Brazil during the early 17th century with circumstances in Angola and the Spanish Americas during that period. There's a huge amount of work to be done, but I think it will be useful to try to look back at this early slave trade to Spanish America from Angola in the 1570s, and even into and then it stops after the 1570s, picks up in the late 1580s a bit. All voyages, 2 or 3 voyages, I think 3, like the one I mentioned, that were supposed to go to Brazil from Angola. They're supposed to go to Brazil, but then they get blown off course allegedly towards the Spanish America. There's 3 voyages like that in the late 1580s that go to Hispaniola, to Venezuela, to La Guaira, right near Caracas, and another that goes to Cartagena de Indias. And arriving in Cartagena de Indias, this is a place where there's very little slave trade in the 1580s from West Central Africa to Cartagena de Indias. So it was noticeable, right? It was notable. And then in the early 1590s, we have much better. We have this is the beginning of really, really rich, detailed information for the slave trade from Angola to the Spanish Caribbean, and soon afterwards to Buenos Aires also. So there's a lot of work to be done here. I've been particularly interested in the idea that, I'm just wrapping it up here, and the idea that this, again, my X marking the uprising, right, the resistance on the caravel, Pedro Colombo's caravel, when the enslaved Africans took control of this caravel, right, briefly. There would be, there are many examples subsequently of, as I mentioned a second ago, of slave ships arriving in the Caribbean or Buenos Aires with from Angola with large numbers of women and children. We know that this voyage also had a lot of men on board who were killed during the course of this revolt, or afterwards when the revolt was suppressed. They resisted and were killed in the process. We can explain, the sex ratio and the structure of the captives in terms of the large presence of women and children and girls, right, on board that vessel, the 2 vessels that arrived. But one thing that rarely happens in the slave trade from Angola during this period of the Angola wave to Spanish America, we very rarely have evidence of enslaved people resisting during the course of the voyage. There are very, very, very few cases of known slave ship revolts from Angola. Now, one of the things I've argued is that, well, because there's mostly, children. There's so many children being brought on these ships. So this 1575 voyages, I think they possibly point to an earlier period when there were still a lot of captives to be, a lot of enslaved Africans who were acquired probably, in conflict, warfare. They might have been acquired by the Portuguese in different ways. But this is, perhaps some things qualitatively differently happening in the 1570s, 1580s than what we'll see later on in the early 17th century, when there's not only massive warfare, but also tribute payments, and warfare involving the destruction of entire villages being uprooted. So I think there's grounds. This revolt, I think, is really significant, and it gives us it gives us room for comparison later. One other aspect that I think we can sort of use to try to analyze the beginnings of this Angola wave is that some of the same investors and voyage backers, or avançadores, who appear in the list in the Biblioteca da Ajuda list in 1579 to 1585, some of the same people who financed slaving voyages from Angola, probably to Brazil, or perhaps back to Lisbon or Portugal, some of those same individuals show up later in the 1590s, very early 1600s, as ascentistas, or backers of voyages, slaving voyages from Angola to Spanish America, and from São Tomé to Spanish America, actually. So some of the same financial structure, it was transferred directly from, either transferred directly from this sort of Angola, Brazil, Portugal slave traffic to the Angola, Spanish America traffic, right? And now it might be that rather than a straightforward transfer of knowledge, of capital, there was simply an expansion, right? And that what was already happening in the 1570s, 1580s was simply, built upon to also incorporate the transatlantic slave trade from Angola to Spanish America. Right? So there's a lot of, as I said, room for speculation, but we have a few more sources that we can bring into this, that are broader thinking about the rise of the Angola wave. Right? So thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen now.